Thank you.
There we go.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first EAB meeting in the COVID era. Thank you all very much for both joining and for accommodating our still evolving practices of being able to adapt to these new physically distanced settings. I'm delighted not only to have a bunch of my colleagues from staff here, but also guests from the Open Space Board of Trustees, as well as the Environmental Advisory Board members. We also are joined tonight from staff by Brenda Rittenauer, who's been helping all of us get up to speed on these new technologies. And so Brenda, perhaps you could give us kind of the ground rules for how we operate in this setting.
Absolutely, thank you, Brett. As Brett said, my name is Brenda. I'm part of our engagement team at the city, and we have been supporting boards here in the COVID era as we move into a virtual space. A lot of that support is finding the right balance between having a welcoming meeting where people can participate as you are used to when we are in person, and having a secure meeting where we can't be disrupted by those folks across the world who are using platforms like this these days in order to put forward disturbing images and sounds and words. And so we want our meetings to be safe, to do the business of the city of Boulder. And so we've instituted some virtual meeting rules that I will share with you now. I'm going to open that up and share my screen briefly. You'll just give me one moment to do so. It's small for some reason. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yep. Tiny?
No, it's okay.
Tiny to me. Okay.
It is a little tiny.
Just my screen. All right. So I find when I do the slideshow, sometimes it becomes difficult to use.
There we go.
Looks like that's better. Okay. You'd think I'd have this all down by now. Zoom is a new thing every day. So our rules very quickly. We've been called to order to conduct the business of the city of Boulder. Anything that disrupts or delays that business, prohibited. Time for speaking and asking questions may be limited. You may only speak when recognized by the chair, and you shall not speak longer than the time allotted. We'll have a timer on screen for you. Each person, we did not register for this meeting, so you'll indicate you'd like to participate in open comment or public comment by using the raise hand function, which I'll go over when we get there. But we do need each person who would like to speak to show their first and last name in association with their presence on the screen. So if your first and last name show now, you're in great shape. If you only have a first name or something that's not a name, we need you to change that. I can do that for you if you're not familiar with how to do that. Just send me your name in the chat and I'm happy to help take care of that. No video is permitted other than board and staff members and invited guests. Again, that helps keep our meeting safe and secure from disruption. The person presiding over the meeting, who is our chair, Justin Brandt, will enforce these rules or direct me to enforce these rules by muting folks as necessary. The chat function is enabled, but should be only to me, the host, and only about technical questions. I'm not able to respond to any questions about the content of the meeting. And the board members also will not be using the chat function so that you are seeing the whole conversation that is taking place. And only the host and individuals designated by the host will be able to share their screens at tonight's meeting. So those are our quick rules that help keep us safe. We appreciate everyone's cooperation in those rules. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brenda. With that, I'd now like to introduce the board chair for the Environmental Advisory Board. As some of you know, every year we change board chairs. Our board chair of last year, Michael Clementes, didn't get a very full term, so we've asked him to serve as our sort of co-chair this year. But Justin, when he's available, will be leading our meetings. So with that, I'd like to introduce Justin Brandt.
Thanks, Brett. And I guess since we've been delayed and this is Susan's first meeting on EAB, probably makes sense as a board just to go around and introduce ourselves. So I'm Justin Brandt. Maybe my third year on EAB. I've was a fill-in term, so I'm serving less than a full term. I guess in my non-EAB life, I work at a nonprofit called the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. We advocate for energy efficiency and clean energy in 6 southwestern states. I guess I'll pass it over to Mike.
Hey, Susan, I'm Mike St. Clements, and I guess this is my third year on EAB. I can't remember now. In my non-EAB time, I am the Director of Terrestrial Science for the National Ecological Observatory Network and a faculty member at CU Boulder in the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research.
Miriam, are you able to talk? Introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, Susan. This is Miriam Hacker, and I have been on the board for, I guess, around three years as well. I am an environmental engineer and air quality specialist and have my own business. Pass you go.
Great. Thanks, Miriam. And then, yes, Susan, go ahead. Marty, it doesn't look like Marty's here.
Hi, everybody. I can't wait to meet you personally. This is my first environmental advisory board meeting, so I have no track record to speak of. I am a retired engineer. I spent most of my career in high tech and some time in renewable energy. And I think climate action is the most important issue to me to spend my time on in my retirement. And that's why I applied for this board. So I'm really delighted to be here and excited to learn from all of you.
Great. Thanks. Nice to meet you virtually. And yeah, hopefully we'll get a chance in some time to meet in person.
Yeah, maybe next time.
I guess with that, we need to approve our minutes from, is it February or the March meeting? I guess we had a March meeting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yes, March meeting.
So anyone?
I will second that approval.
Move to approve them. All right, the minutes from the March meeting are approved. And we can move on to public comment. Seems like there are a few folks. I don't know, sounds like you would use the raise hand function that Brenda can go over if you want to submit public comment.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have some folks from the public. So folks, if you would like to participate in open comment, you can use your raised hand function. You find that by scrolling your mouse over the bottom or top of your screen and opening and clicking the icon that says participants. When that box opens, you'll see a button that says raise hand, and you can click on that button. If for some reason you can't find that button, just go ahead and put an indication in the chat that you would like to do so, and I will make sure that we recognize you. Also, if you're on the phone, I don't think I have anyone on the phone today, but just in case you are, you can press *9 to indicate that you would like to speak, and that will raise your hand. So far we have one person. So do you want to go ahead with a visible timer, Justin?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. So hi, Elizabeth, thanks for participating. And I think as usual, we're gonna try to keep public comments to 3 minutes. So to make that a little smoother, I think Brenda can put a timer on the screen for all of us.
There we go. All right, so Elizabeth, I'm coming to you and I'm going to unmute you. We'd like you to spell your first and last name and then begin speaking. I'll start the timer after you spell your name.
It's Elizabeth Black. Hi, Open Space staff and a unanimous Open Space Board of Trustees are recommending management changes for irrigable agricultural acres in the project area north of J and mainly west of the diagonal. Over 1,000 of these northern acres are so significantly damaged by prairie dogs as to render them unleasable. Without a rapid change of policy, some of these ag lands may be impossible to restore. The city has spent over $25 million to purchase the 30+ ag properties in the project area, many of which are now in danger of losing their topsoil and valuable water rights. Meanwhile, OSMP has set aside over 6,000 acres system-wide acres where prairie dogs will be permanently protected in perpetuity. OSMP and OSBT have spent years studying this complex issue and have come up with a preferred alternative. We at HEAL feel like we have compromised over and over in getting to the preferred alternative, which is just a beginning baby step to heal the land. But often the first step in a new direction is the hardest, and we congratulate OSMP on screwing up their courage enough to take this first baby step. OSMP will report progress annually, and there will be opportunities to change course as needed. We have heard that the Prairie Dog Working Group is going to propose cutting the project area in half. We do not support this change. We think that it's a disruption to the robust public process and the trust and all the work that people have put in to date. The preferred alternative recommended by OSMP staff and a unanimous OSBT includes first allowing lethal control on irrigated agricultural lands, and secondly, changing the borough disturbance ordinance to allow for some agricultural activities. OSBT at their last meeting asked OSMP staff to expand their proposed changes to the borough disturbance ordinance. We second that request. We ask that you support local food as a priority on OSMP ag land and allow all normal agricultural activities to disturb boroughs on irrigated agricultural lands, not just those restricted to 3 inches or 6 inches in depth. Harvesting carrots and potatoes requires more than 6 inches of depth. So does plowing to break up compaction, or keyline plowing to restore land, or tilling to kill invasive weed roots. We at HEAL ask that you send a strong message of support to City Council for OSMP and OSBT's preferred alternative with these changes to the borough disturbance proposal. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Exactly 3 minutes. I am impressed. And thank you for sending the materials you emailed to us earlier. They were very helpful. So are there?
I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time. I always like to give people one more chance, so I'll explain it again. Just if you scroll your mouse over the top or bottom of your screen and you click on the icon that says participants, you will open a box that has a raised hand function at the bottom. You can also find that through the top right-hand corner of your little box on the screen. There's 3 dots. Click on those 3 dots and you'll find the same option. But I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this time, Justin.
Great. Then let's move on.
Okay.
I think at this point, we're going to move. I really appreciate Cart Brown from the Open Space Board of Trustees taking the time to join us today. I think on the past, when we've learned about and debated and made recommendations on these issues, we've really looked to you guys if you have put a lot more time and effort into what's sort of a complicated issue than we've been able to. So really appreciate you taking the time. I don't know if there's sort of anything you want to start off by saying, or if you're just sort of here for us to ask you questions, but I'll leave it up to you.
Thanks, Justin. I'll just say a couple brief things. Excuse me. First, our board really appreciates the fact that EAB has been part of the conversation for the last couple of years. It's really helped. I know Counsel has appreciated having the perspective of more than just one board, because this is a difficult issue and complicated, and it certainly falls within your portfolio too. So thank you very much for taking the time to work on this. This has been a very accelerated process, and I want to acknowledge the incredible work of all the open space staff and other city staff to try to wrestle this thing to the ground. And Mark Gershman has really pitched in and stepped up to help work on this thing. And excuse me, since we've got him here, I don't think I'll need to describe any of the details of the proposed program. As you know, a year ago, the Open Space Board unanimously recommended to Council that we look at a new approach to managing prairie dogs on our irrigated agricultural lands in the north. And Council directed staff to take an expedited effort to do analysis, consult with the public, and then come back with a proposal. They came back to us in March, and the board unanimously supported their proposal. We weighed in a couple areas, mostly just to try to add additional resources to the effort, given that we realized what a big job it was going to be. We also asked that staff look for ways that we could move fairly quickly to give our lessees on our irrigated agricultural lands more flexibility to carry out their agricultural operations in the presence of prairie dog colonies. Staff came back to us at our last meeting, gave us an updated program proposal, which we liked. We weighed in and said that we hope that they could continue to negotiate the borough destruction ordinance modification. The proposal at that point was to allow disturbance up to 3 inches in depth. We felt it would be better for our lessees and to maintain the land if they could get a little bit more flexibility than that. As you may know, and I think Brett is informed, the final result of the negotiation has not been released to council yet, and so we can't break the hold on that. But I feel very strongly that staff has done a really good job to try to create as much flexibility as is possible, and I know the board will continue to strongly support implementation of this program. So again, my thanks to all the people that have worked on it. I will be happy to answer any questions, but I suspect if they're detailed, I will defer to Mr. Gershman. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate it. So I guess on the disturbance piece, it seems like, I guess my understanding is that OSBT, so the last, I guess, written document we have before us recommended a minimum or a maximum of 3 inches of disturbance of prairie dog burrows. And I guess I understand that you guys have taken a sort of OSBT in their recommendations has taken a more sort of expansive view of that, or felt that a sort of more significant disturbance would be allowable?
I think we were hoping staff could negotiate conditions under which there could be greater levels of disturbance. Yes, and okay. I'm confident that you know, while maybe the program doesn't cover all the things we'd love to be able to do regarding carbon sequestration and soil restoration as quickly as we might like to do them, I think we feel strongly that it is a great step forward, and I think Elizabeth said the same thing. And so we're happy to support the package that will go to council, even though there is unfortunate timing here that neither your board nor our board is able to see the final proposal in its details.
Yeah, appreciate that and the timing issues. Well, thank you.
You bet.
I appreciate that. I don't know if any other members of EAB have any questions for Kurt.
So I guess I have one question, which is there the flexibility, or is there a pathway for if this goes forward and we find or we determine that there's, you know, additional disturbance might provide better results in the future if research comes up or we find that it's not sufficient, or is a pathway to revise some of these disturbance depths in a relatively quick fashion, rather than if we realize that there's a better depth to go to, or that, you know, it's not sufficient but we're already heading down this path so that we can do a more thorough job? Is there any talk around that?
You know, I think I'd let Mark talk about the flexibility and the adaptive management that's inherent in the program.
Okay.
And thanks, Kurt and Michael. That's a great question. I think Kurt alluded to the fact that through the recommendations of the Prairie Dog Working Group and a subset of those recommendations that were then relayed to the Open Space Board of Trustees and City Council for their support, the Open Space and Mountain Parks Department is committed to annual updates. We actually opened the community process in October for this management review at a kind of a joint meeting, the first of those annual updates, as well as kind of the first opportunity to collect information about community values and trying to build an understanding of the situation, or a shared understanding of the situation. So those annual meetings will continue to provide us opportunities to share with the community, interested parties. And we've been working kind of with community groups such as one that Elizabeth represents, individual community members who are neighbors of open space, our tenants, other open space land management agencies who have been our long-term partners in trying to figure out the best way to address these complex issues, advocates for the well-being of prairie dogs on the landscape, as well as organizations such as Boulder County Nature Association and Audubon. Sierra Club is aligned with the Keep Boulder Wild group to come up with ideas to improve the situation. So each year we'll have the opportunity to say, these are experiences, this is what worked well for us, this is something that didn't work so well for us, this is new information from the research community, here are some proposals we have to do course corrections. I'll be talking a little bit out of my realm of responsibility, but I think it's fair to say from the experience I've gained that the existing city code and a portion of the city code referred to as the Wildlife Protection Ordinance that we're working with allows for the application to the city manager for a special permit. And a special permit requires that council be notified that the permit has been received and the kind of nature of the permit, but there would not necessarily be a requirement that such an action, go through a lengthy public process, or council, at their leisure could elect what to do with that. Because it's prairie dogs and we're older, it's quite likely that there'll be a lot of community interest. So any major deviations or deviations around things that were of kind of a high level of community interest have a greater likelihood to be called up by council or even by our board to ensure that the community has an opportunity to share the thoughts. And we don't want to ever remove from council their ability to be the ones responsible for policy. So if something's, looked at as a significant policy change, that would certainly end up before council. And that would be, I don't want to say it's hard, but it would just be a more time consuming process.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
I guess Susan, Miriam, do you have any questions for Kurt, and can let him enjoy the rest of the evening?
Marty's in the waiting room too now. I just wanted to let everyone know. Maybe.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I didn't notice.
No worries.
Yeah, I have one question or concern. I'm not sure which, as I read the reports through my environmental and climate change eyes, I kept wondering or wishing that there was more discussion about what's the right balance between agricultural lands and more native grasslands from a carbon sequestration perspective. And I wondered if perhaps there's already been discussion on that I haven't been a part of, but is that part of the consideration?
Kurt, do you want me to try to respond to that, or would you like to take the first shot?
Well, I'll say what the board understood, but I will then have Mark correct me and fill in the details. And one of the unique things about this project area is that it's been irrigated and plowed for so many years. And so it takes many decades up there to try to restore anything like a native grassland or prairie. And so certainly we have projects underway that Brett is very familiar with to try to rehabilitate lands, but I don't know that anyone has a reasonable expectation that we could very quickly turn any of the irrigated lands that have been irrigated for 100 years, plowed for 100 years, into real native grasslands. I mean, we still have some native grasslands in the south where we do have prairie dog colonies that are more sustainable. Mark, I'll let you correct anything I said that was wrong.
Mark, maybe I could also.
Nothing you said was wrong at all. Thank you, Kurt. And I'll ask Brett to chime in too after this. That's a great question. And I wish I could say that we had enough knowledge to understand the relative roles that all the different ecological systems, both native, slightly modified, highly modified, novel ecological systems play in this complex puzzle about carbon sequestration. We do know that there is some research supporting the fact that native grasslands, native forests play extremely important roles in carbon sequestration, and having those systems active in carbon sequestration is very important. As Kurt indicated, we've got a century plus of modification of these irrigated landscapes, a very highly simplified ecological system, one that is dependent on supplemental water. And one thing that we do know is that when that water is not applied, these systems tend to collapse relatively quickly because the fewer species of largely introduced European hay grasses, the things if you have hay fever like me you're allergic to, can't survive very well. Their root systems tend to degrade and the soil tends to blow away. And so, and that top level layers of soil is where the bulk of the, in that top levels of the humus and the air horizon, where the bulk of the carbon is residing as far as we know. At depth, we know a little less about that. We're trying to gain information about it. But we do feel that these agricultural soils are systems that give us the best opportunities to accelerate carbon sequestration relative to their traditional role. And Brett and others, including Andy Pelster and Lauren Kolb, who unfortunately aren't here to speak, share more information about the work that the city is doing to gain a better understanding of that, and to work with farmers and ranchers to do that, to accelerate and basically farm carbon into the soil and use this as one of the strategies to accomplish our climate action plan goals that are focused in the kind of ecological tier of that project. And our hope too is that can also have beneficial effects on agricultural productivity, so it becomes a win-win situation.
Yeah, if I could jump in for a sec. Susan, I'm a soil scientist. My PhD's in soil biogeochemistry, and I would say, anytime you transition from a native forest or a native grassland to an agricultural system, you tend to lose carbon. But if you have a degraded land, there's a lot of opportunity to add carbon and sequester carbon under wisely managed agriculture, and to form like a grassland and create those like molic epipedons that store a lot of carbon takes a long time, but you can sequester quite a carbon if you're managing a agricultural system well too, compared to a degraded land. So I think it's a very it's a a scale. So but I think Mark did a good job of summarizing.
Yeah, and I mean, Susan, I guess we talked about this at previous meetings, and maybe once we get through with talking with our I want to be cognizant of the time of the folks from OSBT and OSMP as we think about this as a board. Perhaps Brett can sort of fill you in on some of the research he's been involved in around carbon sequestration on some of these lands.
Yeah, Justin, if I could just add really quickly, there is active research now starting on our lands on all those aspects. So in fact, OSMP has funded Elizabeth Black to start gathering some soil carbon data from our native grasslands. Lauren Kolb has been starting to develop a systematic soil sampling process across our agricultural lands. And so I think we're starting to build the baseline of knowledge with which we can start answering those important questions you've asked.
And Susan, I really appreciate you asking that, because in a way, a lot of our work as a department has been, and maybe this is maybe the case for a lot of folks, is we've had the good fortune of working with a lot of good stewards in the agricultural community. But a lot of our focus has been above ground in terms of looking at floristic vegetation composition, wildlife, and trying to get a handle on that. until Lauren joined the staff, we really hadn't had a lot of expertise in this field. We are working with Tim Seestead, who is a professor from University of Colorado, also in STAR. I don't know if he's emeritus yet, but working with him as a contracted researcher to help in the design and analysis of the soil data that we're collecting. We called for it back in 2010 as part of the Council accepted or Council approved Grassland Ecosystem Management Plan, but we just really didn't have the capacity to undertake and develop the monitoring system and develop the standards that we thought we needed. So it's been a long path, but we're really glad to be there.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for the good information.
I just want to welcome Marty, who's joining us. Marty, nice to see you, or nice to have you here again. If you have a chance to turn on your video, that'd be fantastic. We just went through our initial opening parts of the agenda and had heard our first comments from OSBT Chair Kurt Brown. And this is a segment in which we invited any of the board members that were interested to ask questions of Kurt before we let him go.
Well, let me say hi. Let me say hi.
Hi, Marty.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. We won't talk about bureau issues today, will we?
I hope not.
It's good to see you. I'm sorry I missed the first part of the presentation. I was late. I'll catch up and hopefully we'll chat again.
Okay, great. Good to see you.
Thanks,
Take care.
Marty. Welcome. I guess, are there any other questions for Kurt?
I appreciate the opportunity, guys. Good luck.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your
bet.
time.
And
Thanks, Kurt.
Mark.
Good to see you.
Yep.
So I guess now if there are any, I think now is our opportunity. Seems like Mark's been jumping in a lot, but if there are any more questions related to the, I guess I don't know if there's any sort of introductory comments, Mark, you'd want to say, or if you're just here to answer any questions we might have on the information we've been provided.
Mark, you're muted.
Thank you. I know that Brett was able to provide you with the materials that we had given to the board on July 8th for our update before we went to council. And that pretty well reflects the preferred alternative. I think both Kurt and Elizabeth did a good job in summarizing the action that the board asked us to adjust to, and I think we've done our best to respond to that. At about 6 o'clock tomorrow, I've been told the city clerk will be posting the council agenda packet, so that's when that information will be shared with council and the rest of the community. It's not a big secret, but we really did our best to recognize that our goals as a community in terms of addressing carbon sequestration and carbon drawdown are really important. We have a long history of seeking to prevent lethal impacts to prairie dogs, especially lethal impacts that aren't reviewed through the city's 6-step process. And those were some of the factors that came into play as we had discussions internally and reviewed the comments that we had received from the community starting in October of last year. Our goal was to work to avoid any de facto lethal control of prairie dogs through agricultural activities. And I just want to make a note too that the prohibitions associated with burrow damage only apply to burrows that are occupied by prairie dogs. So once prairie dogs are removed from an area through either in-burrow lethal control, plague, or relocation, those areas would no longer be under the jurisdiction of that section of the code of the regulations. So we could return to those areas to do, say, keyline plowing, regardless of depth. There would be no prohibition associated with that. And if we felt it was necessary for some reason to excavate or till or plow or work the soil, we could make the decision to remove the prairie dogs from that area prior to that. We currently don't have any prairie dogs in areas where there are potatoes or carrots being grown. So we didn't feel that some of the real and legitimate concerns about activities that may require or do require disturbance at depth, we didn't feel that, since those weren't happening right now, that wasn't something that we needed to provide a lot of focus on. And again, we have other tools such as fencing, visual barriers of vegetation, et cetera, to limit the spread of prairie dogs in the direction of places where such activities are occurring.
Appreciate that.
Great.
I guess I had a few questions. I mean, one is, so the memo we have talks about, and you mentioned, you know, essentially trying to limit disturbance so that it doesn't cause the death of prairie dogs, so it's not a de facto lethal control. And I guess I'm just curious, sort of, is there research on, you know, the magnitude of disturbance or how you would implement a policy to sort of reach that goal?
There isn't research of which we are aware that speaks directly to that. One of the more significant concerns has to do with the fact that many of these agricultural activities unfortunately coincide with the period when there are dependent young in the burrows. So prairie dogs are born, they're altricial, they're born hairless, blind, and completely dependent on their parents, like rabbits. You know, they develop basically kind of external to the womb for quite a while. So although adult prairie dogs or mature prairie dogs would be in a position to burrow out, it would be challenging or impossible for these very small prairie dogs. They're only, you know, a couple of grams, you know, half an ounce or so, 10 or 15 grams. So it'd be very difficult for them to burrow out, and probably challenging for the adult prairie dogs or the female prairie dogs to locate, retrieve, and, you know, bring them to an alternative place of safety. So that's kind of one of the major. Is there research? No, but is there enough strong inference from what we know about the life history characteristics of prairie dogs? I'd say yes, that would be a legitimate concern. And I would say our knowledge about, you know, what happens with increasing depth becomes, you know, it's probably very difficult to say. We don't know a lot about what actually goes on at depth in prairie dog colonies. There's just not been a lot of work there.
Helpful. And then I guess on a slightly different note, I guess it's concerning to me in the memo how much of, you know, land has been taken out of agriculture because it's, you know, becoming degraded. And I guess sort of following removal, I was wondering if there's are there steps that you've laid out about how to bring these lands back into agricultural management, or how we can work to, you know, regain the topsoil we've lost?
And I don't know if Andy's been able to join the call yet, and Brett may know a little bit more about this. Sometimes I wish I were more familiar with some of these things. I will say that, you know, one of the first steps, of course, is to doing this in the presence of active prairie dog colonies is something that we have a little bit of experience on one of our open space properties that had a long and severe land history. Not necessarily just from prairie dogs, but from historic agricultural activities. And we had pretty much seen all the soil just deflated down to where the topsoil is just basically lost, and we had a lot of exposed cobbles and what have you, not a lot of organic matter. We went in there with keyline plowing, application of large amounts of compost, and tried to reestablish some cover crops and some grass crops, not even native grass crops, but relatively aggressive crops with relatively aggressive irrigation. But some of the burrow destruction or burrow damage ordinances prohibited the activities associated with keyline plowing and cultivation of that land. And while there was some initial success of the idea, doing that in the presence of prairie dogs didn't show a lot of eventual success. So I think one of our hopes would be that through the process of removal, we'll be able to use these processes of plowing at depth, breaking up the compacted soils, irrigating and introducing compost, and then a kind of successional seeding pattern with some cover sterile sorghum and things like that to help the introduced pasture grasses, which are pretty aggressive in irrigated systems, become established. But beyond that kind of general information, I really wouldn't have a whole lot more specifics. Brett probably does.
Well, I wanted to again note the really exciting evolution and development that's taking place in OSMP around this. So it was just a couple of years ago that OSMP added this new soil health coordinator position, Lauren Kolb. And then this year, last year it sort of started, but this year, Eric Fairley, who's the stewardship coordinator, is actively out experimenting with a whole range of different treatments for recovery of lands. This year we had to start on areas that were outside of this kind of conflict zone. But I think that as we get new guidance and new capabilities and tools in our toolbox, we can expand some of those treatments. So I was going to suggest that this might be an area for the board, if they're interested, we might even at some point be able to create a field trip or some kind of engagement with Eric and Lauren, because I think the scope of work that they're doing to start exploring these types of recovery and regeneration techniques is quite exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. We can chat about that later.
I guess that raised, I kind of have a question, which is, we talked about the plowing to 3 inches with, prairie dog, young offspring there. So is there going to be, I guess I'm not clear, like how often that would be employed and like what you gain from actually plowing, but not, I'm still not clear on what you gain from plowing, but not necessarily removing prairie dogs. So like if you're just, is the hope that you can go in also in places and just do some shallow plowing and you might gain a little something, but the prairie dogs remain? Is that something that's like, how widespread would that scenario be?
I think that restoration and keyline plowing and other sorts of plowing at depth are just some of the agricultural activities that we were considering. Many of these lands, the primary activity that the farmers and ranchers are interested in doing don't require necessarily going very deep. So in fact, the proposal that was approved by the Open Space Board of Trustees was that disturbances of the burrow entrances or mounds, which lie above the typical ground surface, don't have kind of a height limitation above ground that could be disturbed. And from the perspective of our farmers who are trying to operate irrigated hayfields and pastures, being able to level those burrow mounds, potentially fill some of those burrow mounds, would greatly improve their success at applying irrigation water, which then won't get diverted around these mounds and affected by that, and operate their equipment to mow, bale, ted, or fluff out the hay. So a lot of it was just almost superficial interference with typical agricultural activities.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Seeding, maybe another example there.
Okay, great. That was my last big question, I think, for the moment.
Any other questions for Mark, folks? Great. Well, thanks, Mark. Really appreciate you coming before us.
That was really helpful. Thank you, Mark.
Well, it looks like Andy Pelster is here. So if there were, Andy is the supervisor of our agriculture and water stewardship program. And he was, I think, waylaid by a thunderstorm in eastern Colorado or western Nebraska. So would there be anything for him? I'm sure he'd be happy to get back on the road to get back home though, too. Okay, well, if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate. Brett has been a very important part of our team around these issues. As you can see, we're learning a lot. Brett is both supporting us in that and leading us in that in certain instances, and we are doing what we can and are very interested in supporting the goals of the climate commitment, the climate action plan, so that you know, we're an important part of the city's ability to do that. And it's great to work in concert with you guys. And Michael, given your experience and active research in this area, if you haven't already been, you might get your shoulder tapped by some of our staff as well.
Yeah, and actually, I actually know Lauren Kolb from, we did our PhDs at the same time at University of Maine, so I actually know her pretty well.
Oh, great. Wow, lucky us. Well, fantastic.
Yep.
Well, again, very much.
Yep, thank you.
Andy, you made it home safe. Good job.
I did. I planned on being home a little earlier, but we had to wait out a pretty heavy thunderstorm in Fort Morgan. So I apologize for missing my portion of the meeting.
Well, yeah, appreciate it. I think, I don't know if there are other questions for OSMP staff, or if we just want to move on. I think, you know, ideally it would be great as a board, we could come together and make a resolution to council if we can, you know, reach consensus on something. I think this is our sort of opportunity to weigh in one more time on this issue. But I don't know, I appreciate you making it, Andy, but I don't know that we have anything else for you.
Great. Thanks for considering the issue, and good luck.
Thank you. So, yeah, I mean, I think we have the opportunity to make a recommendation to council here. I guess I'd hope we could reach some consensus, and if, you know, I know time is tight on this, so ideally we can do it in real time on this call. If we can, I know there are some, you know, potential opportunities to do it through our shared drive, but I think it needs to be done by the end of the week anyway. Correct, Brett? This is going to council next week.
Yeah, I think if there's any chance that we could get something done tonight and that the board chair could draft a letter with your recommendation to council, that would be ideal. Because I know the board, the council tends to take their incredibly large packets and take the weekend to try to digest them and look at the input from all the various boards, et cetera.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this, I'm in support of this. I think it's great, to be honest. I think I like the idea of, you know, restoring land and balancing agriculture and wildlife better, and treating these lands that can be irrigated and using them for agriculture, and decreasing and turning that, you know, plot of non-leasable irrigable land around and get it trending in a different direction. I think, and I liked the idea of the flexibility I think, like, Elizabeth made a really good point, which is like, this is an important first step. And I like that you know, I think when you move in a new direction, it's really important to have some avenues to change things, you know, in the future, because you might set off on broadly the right direction, but realize that, you know, there's more information available. And I like that there's it seems, Brett, if I'm correct and understood what saying, that there's a pathway to tweak things in the future. You know, it might require some work, but I think I'm in support. I don't know exactly how we want to word it or how everyone else feels, but
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think I agree with you. It seems like implementing this through a special use permit is a sort of nice way to thread the needle of keeping most, if not most, of the lands protected. We don't have to, you know, don't have to go through the process of updating city ordinances, but like you said, sort of more of an easy fix to change things in the future. So it seems like, you know, they've spent a lot of time trying to balance a lot of disparate stakeholder needs, and I think I'd be willing to support it. You know, I think we're in this awkward position if we don't know exactly what the final recommendation is going to be. So I guess it's a question of, you know, would we want to explicitly support the recommendation from staff without seeing it, or, you know, it seems like we could probably come with some language that would thread the needle, saying, you know, we support the July 8th.
yeah, I was going to say, can we say we support
memo that we've seen with some modifications that, you know, we understand there are modifications to allow more borough disturbance than was laid out in this alternative, but without knowing those final details.
yeah, Brett, is that language we could use, or would that be okay?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think, yes, almost exactly as Justin has described, that you support the preferred alternative as outlined in the July 8th memo. If you have a view about wanting to see some flexibility or what have you around the borough disturbance beyond what was originally stated in the July 8th memo, that would be useful probably to communicate in your recommendation.
Okay. And Marty, you've been quiet tonight. What about Susan? What do you guys think?
And Miriam's still on the call as well.
I know I feel bad bothering her on vacation though, so I'm just.
I think bringing lands back to their, sort of native intention, if we can do that, I think it's a win-win for so many of our environmental concerns. So I'm agreeing with you, Michael. I mean, and so I don't have anything to add. I think just it's very sensible. So another thumbs up, I guess, from another member of the board.
Great, Susan. Realize, we've been hearing about this issue for a number of years. So I realize you might have some background questions, or if there's any other information, I don't know if I can try to go back, but this has been a sort of staff and the city has been going through a multi-year process to sort of consider how and if lethal control should be a viable, or should be considered and should be an option in controlling prairie dog burrows or controlling prairie dogs. I think they've tried as you saw in the memo, removal, so moving them from the north of the city to some southern lands, but it would take, I don't know, 50 years, I think, to move to remove the colonies that have established on lands that are designated for irrigated agriculture. So
extremely costly.
Not really a viable alternative, and that if the goal is to return these lands to being leasable for agriculture, that lethal control is something that needs to be used.
Yeah, I have followed the activities from the Prairie Dog Working Group, even though I haven't been a part of this group. And I have to say that I do lean towards the animal lover, don't like lethal control side. On the other hand, I'm kind of a farm girl. I grew up around farms. And so it's a tough balance to achieve. And I would, if this were an official vote, I would probably abstain given my short tenure in the group, because I'm still kind of on the fence.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's I think, yeah, hear your concerns, and yeah, I think a lot of us have just, I can speak for myself personally, but I think, native food or local food and having the ability to grow it is important to me, for ecology and a number of other things, and that sort of, it's been even more highlighted with COVID and just the need to have more local resilient systems, and that sort of, for me personally, is what tips the balance.
Yeah, I did have one question in that regard. Of the 1,000 or so acres that are impacted, agricultural lands that are impacted by the prairie dog burrows, what percentage of those are like growing vegetables, real farm, and what percentage of that is ranch or ranch related, growing hay, grazing? Anybody know?
A very small proportion of our lands are actually in vegetable production.
Yeah.
But the case of the farm just to the east of the Bennett property that we've been discussing, this is the site that has really been one of the research sites for the city in trying to initiate these recovery activities. While it's more of the grazing land aspect, he's running a CSA for chickens and things. So I think these are still lands producing food directly into the local food system.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that really outside this issue of killing prairie dogs versus, or sort of agriculture versus sort of wildlife, just to emphasize the point that Mark made, we have been unable to successfully regenerate the Bennett property because of the ongoing grazing pressure caused by the prairie dogs. And this is not a condemnation of prairie dogs. It's just the fact that we can't actually get plants reestablished until we can remove the pressures for them enough that they can build their root systems and be able to start being established. So it's just been a really revealing dilemma if we want to restore lands and not have any capacity to take that pressure off those early stage systems. Miriam, did you have any comments? I know you were on vacation, but just to see where you stand on this.
No, just in general that I'm generally supportive of the open space board's proposal and their I support what's being proposed. That's fine.
Great. So seems like we're in agreement with one abstention. So Brett, what would the process be? Would it be for, you said for me to sort of write a memo to council outlining this as the board's recommendation?
Yeah, Heidi, are you taking notes? Heidi, are you on mute?
I'm taking very high level.
Well, I was just wondering if you might take notes for this specific moment, because I think it would actually be ideal if you could come up with the language for a recommendation to council, and that we as staff could then just draft that onto something, and Justin, you could sign your name to it and we could send it to council. That way there's no question about what the board said and there's no more need for review through that public document process.
Yeah.
It could be as simple as just saying, you know, the Environmental Advisory Board recommends with one abstention that the council support the preferred alternative as presented in the July 8th memo, and then any qualifications that you want to make around the borough disturbance piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we discussed is, yeah, just saying with, you know, yeah, we understand that. Sorry, the July 8th memo with understanding that, you know, more borough disturbance than the 3 inches are, you know, included in this recommendation will likely be included. I believe that's accurate. But, you know, I think I trust that. It seems like the open space mountain park staff have done and negotiating with stakeholders to try to come up with something greater than the 3 inches in this memo and less than unlimited, and, you know, realize that I'm sure some folks would want, you know, we've heard from the public any agricultural activities to be allowed, but I guess I trust that they've come up with some reasonable safeguards, at least to start.
I'll tell you what, let's do this. Heidi and I can work on, while you move to your next item, we could work on a draft resolution for you. And then, you know, in half an hour, we can come back and give you a draft to choose from, and that maybe we can get that language right. So I think I have a sense of what you want to say. Heidi, I think I can actually do this. I'll draft a draft for you and just give you about 15 minutes and you can come back to it.
Great, thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Brett. If you just want to send that to me privately in the chat, that would be great.
Okay.
Great. Is there anything else on prairie dogs, or should we move on to our next agenda item?
I was just going to say that I have, just by chance from this earlier discussion today, that I have this statement from the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, in 1938 open on my computer that says, the social lesson of soil waste is that no man has the right to destroy soil, even if he does own it in fee simple. The soil requires a duty of man, which we have been slow to recognize. From 1938, that was interesting. I just was having this conversation, was like, oh, that's just sitting there.
You want to include that in your resolution? I think it's beautiful.
It is kind of beautiful, but we don't need to include it, but we could. I don't know. It's just like sitting on it's been on my computer since this morning. I was just like, oh yeah, that's fitting.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. So now we're on to
The Chautauqua. Is that
Chautauqua.
next?
Yeah, and so with that, I'd like to introduce or invite my colleague, Jonathan Cohen, who's been a real leader in this work with Chautauqua, to give us an update on that effort.
Thank you, Brett. Everybody can hear me okay, I'm assuming? Good, appreciate the thumbs up. Okay, so here is what I hope to do. First of all, I'm really delighted to be with the board tonight for your first kind of virtual meeting. It's a little bit clunky, but we'll get through it. I actually have 2 items for you tonight. I'm gonna take you through both the Chautauqua update and also the Excel update. I'm not really seeking any recommendations for both items. They really are updates, but I do want to take any questions, particularly on the Excel issue. I mean, your first meeting back and you're dealing with prairie dogs and you're dealing with municipalization. So the only thing we could add perhaps is homelessness or affordable housing to make this a trifecta. So with regard to the Chautauqua issue, again, I have just a couple of slides. Really appreciate the opportunity to brief you on where we are on the Chautauqua Sustainability and Resilience Plan. I spoke to the board, I believe it was mid-2019, and we talked a bit about where we were at that time. But I guess I should introduce myself for those of you I don't know or that don't know me. I'm the Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the city, and I'm really delighted, again, to work alongside with Brett and so many amazing colleagues at the city. And, you know, I would say this particular project is very emblematic of the types of relationships and partnerships that we have really been trying to cultivate within our Climate Initiatives Department. And so I will switch over to a couple of slides, but let me just tee this up with some broad brush remarks. Really starting back in 2019, the city of Boulder and the Chautauqua Association started this conversation about how do we meaningfully kind of lean into this idea, designing a sustainability and resilience plan for the Chautauqua site. And when I talk about Chautauqua, I'm really referring to the 40 acres of land owned by the city of Boulder, 26 acres of which are leased to CCA. And so it really is that built environment component. But I want to stress, as we think about vulnerabilities and we think about the solutions to address those vulnerabilities, it really is looking more broadly at the entire site, because as we think about the various systems, our ecosystems are critically important in thinking about how we design for kind of a holistic approach at the site. So in 2019, we designed and put together a steering committee, which was comprised of key city staff, as well as members from the Chautauqua board and Chautauqua staff. And the intent was to design the project charter. You received that in the packet, which also was kind of a number of documents, one being an informational packet that went to Council in mid-July, but we also included the charter and the vulnerabilities assessment for your background. So that steering committee was really, its first task was to essentially design an RFP and hire a consultant to really do the very first vulnerabilities assessment at Chautauqua. Now, why this is really interesting is that, you know, there have been a number of, I guess, modeling efforts that have taken place over the years at Chautauqua in terms of what are the risks and vulnerabilities. But this was the first time it was a really strong forecasting approach. Really, what does it look like with climate change? What are those risks now? And what will they look like in the future? And I think that's a really important piece about understanding the trajectory and the full breadth of the vulnerabilities for Chautauqua. So in January of this year, we really started to look at understanding, first of all, what are the vulnerabilities, how we can achieve kind of sustainability and resilience and equity within the Chautauqua site. Then we looked at, or now we're looking at, how do we execute the identified actions to kind of address those vulnerabilities? And then how do we evergreen that report? So there have been a number of studies done at Chautauqua, particularly about how you harmonize the issue of of energy systems, for example, or sustainability with that historic preservation concern. Our strong feeling is we need this report to be sustainable, and it should actually be something we could use long into the future. So I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm going to hope that this actually works, but I have two presentations. Let's do this one. Okay, so if you could let me know if you see some PowerPoint slides, just some nodding heads. Okay, great. So I just have 3 slides here. This is just a pretty picture. I just intended to have it open while I was making those open remarks. But what I want to do is kind of move to a bit of the project timeline. This is probably what is most interesting to all of you. So again, I already referenced this. Step 1 has been, what are the vulnerabilities? So the assessment that you have in your packet really identifies the specific climate change risk at Chautauqua and why it's important. And so it was really interesting to distinguish between a vulnerability and a risk. So for example, risks are, of course, we know that wildfire or flooding is a risk at the site. How does that change over time? Does it get better or worse with a changing climate? How does that then interact with the other systems on the site, whether it be energy systems or ecosystems or our social systems? So it was a really important new way of looking at the vulnerabilities. And this was really prompted, I think, by our early work in the city when we designed our resilience strategy and started thinking about defining and talking about resilience in a different way. And the second step is, again, what are our options? This is the phase that we're in right now. We had not started this the last time we spoke. And one of the reasons for that is trying to understand how you identify not just the actions that our consultant identified, but how do we really rely on the expertise that exists both within our staffs and within our community to say what's not there. So what we have done over the past couple of months is assembled study groups. And those groups are really both, as the words on the screen say, to review and expand the options that are identified in the vulnerabilities assessment. There were some near-term actions that were identified by Paul Shanowski and his team at Resilient Analytics. And then also to get public feedback in those areas. So you've heard me say a couple times system areas. The areas that we've identified for priority are energy systems, fire and heat, water and drainage, vegetation, and then a bit of a holistic approach thinking about a resiliency district. So I'm going to pause on that one for a minute because it's easy to recognize that parts and pieces of the other systems would support and fit into a resiliency district. The reason that we're kind of prioritizing this one is thinking about what are the policies and what are the recommendations that we could have with City Council, for example, to perhaps either increase or release some of the barriers and restrictions that exist and really treat the site in a different way. So we might be able to toggle different actions and strategies differently if we're thinking about the area as a district. We already have the designation as a historic district, but really if our approach is to work with Chautauqua to design the most sustainable and resilient historic district in the world, then we need to treat kind of the foundation of what we are working with in a different way. The third step is how do we get there? So after we've identified the best steps, then what do we do after that? So that is the step that we are envisioning to take place in the upcoming months. We will develop a full set of recommendations. Each of the study areas or study groups is intended to kind of complete their report by the end of August, early September. We would then begin going back to the boards. We would come back to the EAB if you would like us to, and of course share those with the community, be able to put it out on our website, Be Heard Boulder, and then of course give that briefing to City Council on what we believe the most viable short and long-term actions are at the site. Then you might be asking yourself, well, okay, great. So we know what needs to be done. How do we actually make that happen? Well, part of that is really the implementation phase. The steering committee has envisioned that we move into this phase 2. That really looks at that short-term implementation of the actions or the recommended strategies. over a 2 to 5 year period, because there are a lot of issues with regard to funding. How do we make sure that we are prioritizing in a way that makes sense? How do we make sure that we're having the conversation more broadly with CCA, with the cottage owners, with the visitors at the site, and of course, with the rest of the community that has an interest in the site. So this second slide is just a visual depiction of what I just said. You can see moving left to right in spring of 2019 and summer of 2019 and fall really was around the assessment, really kind of developing the framework for the evaluation, moving into the vulnerabilities assessment, which you have a copy of. And, you know, we intended to be further along than we are. And, you know, the reality is COVID has certainly put or really challenged, I think, our process that was really heavy on community engagement. That said, I think we developed a really good alternative through these study groups. And so you can see summer and fall of 2020, assessing the options, being able to provide updates to the community and get feedback through questionnaires and open houses, which will be virtual, and then finalizing the strategy towards the end of this year, and then moving into the next phase, which is the implementation. So I'm going to pause there. I want to make that pretty brief with you all, but I do want to field any questions, concerns, thoughts that you may have about the process or about where we are. And I'd also like to throw out the question, and I'm going to assume the answer, but I'm going to put it out there anyway, that the board would like us to come back later this year, if you have time on your agenda, to go over some of the options and final strategy with all of you, if you have that interest. So I'm going to pause there. Justin, I'll turn it back over to you for questions and comments before we move to our next item.
Thanks. Are there any questions for Jonathan? Seems like Mike, you have one.
I've got one, and then maybe it's kind of an impossible and annoying question in a way. But well, I'm just kind of curious. You know, I think this, I really like this plan. I think it's really thorough and great. And I'm just curious, you know, and you mentioned when talking about it, like funding, and I'm just curious what conversations you've had around how things related to like future, like what are in here, do you envision those coming back, like the usage case scenarios to full, like after COVID, and how will COVID affect funding, and will this need to change based on the COVID funding, or do you see elements of this maybe, do you see like a long-term shift in Chautauqua's usage, or if anyone talked about that just following COVID or like the time? I'm just curious, and like I know that like I said, it's annoying, like a lot of these things are probably unanswerable, but I'm just curious what thoughts are, if there's been any discussions.
You are welcome. You're welcome to ask annoying questions. I don't think it was an annoying question.
Okay.
Honestly.
Well, I mean, it's like impossible to answer.
I say that without having a really good answer to that. I know that there have been conversations that CCA has had in particular about modifications. I mean, their budget was hit just as all of our budgets have been hit.
Mm-hmm.
What I will say in terms of funding the implementation of these strategies, what's been very powerful, at least in the conversations, is if we can move off this kind of abstract, well, we need to kind of develop some solutions and strategies that help us, to an action plan. We've already started identifying specific funding sources, whether they be through state agencies, whether they be grants. And this has always been, I think, the friction point between the city and Chautauqua. I'll just be very honest about kind of the management of the site, and also who pays for what at the site. And I should have said this up front, what has been so extraordinary is the ability to create and strengthen a partnership between the city and Chautauqua on this particular issue. Working with CCA and the Sustainability Committee and staff, it has really been extraordinary. It's an amazing group of people. We've been able to align a lot of our vision between the organizations, come to a much better understanding of roles and responsibilities. And this one is one that we have always kind of said, we look at it from afar and say, we need to do something about longer term sustainability issues. Use water and drainage, for example. Mm-hmm. We talked about the issue of the swales and the repair of the swales. How do you do that? Who pays for that? And no one has been really willing to kind of really entertain and lean into this discussion of, well, what does that look like? Are we just going to replace like for like? Is there a better way of doing this? What are we trying to achieve? Similar, what I think really kicked off a lot of this conversation was on the energy side of issues. So when Chautauqua had come to the city saying we'd like to do some solar on the water tank, well, it prompted a question of, well, why? What is it that you want to achieve by putting solar on the water tank? And as we followed that bouncing ball, it became evident that we need to have a broader cohesive vision between the two organizations to really understand what are we going to do in the short term and why. And then from that emerges a lot of the funding opportunities. And so I'm not going to disclose what those are right now, but what I will tell you is that I have been pleasantly surprised that as we've gotten into this and actually identified the actions, part of the process has been, well, there actually happens to be funding sources to implement some of those things, whether they be, as I say, for grants or state agencies or otherwise. So it was not an obnoxious question at all. I think it's a very good question. But I just want to stress the importance of the relationship building that's occurred.
Great, thanks. That was helpful.
Jonathan, this is Marty. If I can chime in with a question. Thanks for the presentation, and the material is interesting, a lot to absorb. When I think of resiliency and I think of the Chautauqua site, I think of two elements. There's the built structures. So there's folks that go to Chautauqua to enjoy the built structures, whether it's the hall itself or some of the amenities around it, the lodges and so forth, the cabins. And then there's the space, there's the environment, that if the lodges weren't there, people would still flock to Chautauqua as a destination because of the beauty of the environment and the access it gives you to this immediacy of being right up and breathing the Flatirons, right? I mean, it's so dramatic, and the trails that allow you to easily navigate right up to the Flatirons, to scale them if you wished. So when you speak of resiliency, help me understand, are you separating the resiliency of the built structures from the resiliency of the space itself?
Marty, thank you for the question. I appreciate the softball, actually, because this is an area that I have very strong feelings about, and you'll see that here in just a moment. No, it is not just about the built environment. As we think about resilience, our infrastructure and built environment is one dimension. And Chautauqua, I think, is emblematic of the various parts and pieces of how we can illustrate long-term resilience, social resilience. When we get knocked down, how do we get back up? How do we prioritize and understand the relationship between our ecosystems and the built environment? How do we think about that relationship, kind of that time horizon of historic preservation? And so it has created such an interesting opportunity to explore with Chautauqua all of those dimensions of resilience. It's different in exploring in each of those systems areas. So what does a resilient energy system really look like? What is a resilient ecosystem, and what does that look like at that site? How do visitors contribute to the resilience of the site? And that's not just while they're on the site, it's moving to and from and around the site. How can we think about this idea in a much broader and deeper way? So I so appreciate your question, and it's taken a little bit of time as a group to really wrap our arms around what does resilience truly mean? What are we aiming to achieve? And why Chautauqua is such a good candidate to kind of explore all those dimensions.
If I can follow up, Justin, with Jonathan just for a second. I'm a climate scientist, so when we speak about climate change, I know very little. I know as much as you know, to some extent. When I think about Chautauqua and climate change, the risk to me that is the largest risk is fire, and the changing risk of fire as we continue to march into a warmer climate. Not to ignore other risks, but that one would be on the top of my list. And so I imagine a situation, Jonathan, where a fire rages down the slopes. It takes out all of the built structures, all the wooden structures are gone. The forest around there is burnt to a crisp. And I ask, what would return quickest? And what would we want to return quickest? The natural display of the grasses and the trees and the forest, or the built structures? What is it that we really care about? So when I think about climate change risk, I think about fires. I think about those marching down through the Chautauqua, destroying it. And then I asked myself, what would we want to return that space to be like? Would we return it to the space that it is the built structures principally, or would we work on returning it to, and would nature return it for us? Would nature be resilient to grow back the environment that we so dearly love in that space?
I don't think I have an answer for that question, but it's a very good one. It's an interesting kind of mental exercise, and I will.
The scenario.
Yeah, no, it totally is, and we've kind of twisted ourselves up as a steering committee on a number of occasions with a very similar conversation, which is Paul Shanowski, many of you probably know Paul, really helping us understand that the current state at Chautauqua is not its original state. If you look at historic photos, no, it was not covered with great pine trees. I mean, it was a grassland. So the question is, it even complicates your question further, which is, what kind of ecosystem would we want if we suffered a catastrophic wildfire there? Is it that we would expect the forest back because we love trees? Would we allow the ecosystem to evolve as it naturally does? How would we interface with that system in terms of the built environment? Would we, in fact, try to rehabitat that site? Those are all
sugar maple stand. I'm just kidding. Sorry.
What's that?
I said I want a sugar maple stand. I'm just kidding.
Right. No. So I very much appreciate the question, and I don't think that through this process we intend to answer that question. I think what we intend to do, I'll be very honest with you, is to not just protect against all of the risks, but really understand the dynamic nature of the site, and how, and you can speak to this just as well or better than any of us, how the changing circumstances of climate really is much different than backcasting. To be able to say, well, this is what it's always been, let's just use that model and forecast it to say things may look much different here in the future. And how do we want to think about that?
Thank you.
No, thank you. Great questions.
Jonathan, I guess I have a question that might be sort of, I don't know, it might be better in our next agenda item, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And feel free to put it off. I guess seems like in the proposed franchise agreement, there is a project at Chautauqua Microgrid are moving it towards a net zero environment. I don't know what that means. But I guess I'm wondering, so it seems like this resiliency study and the work you're doing is ongoing, sort of the reasoning behind including that in the franchise agreement and sort of what you guys are envisioning there.
Yeah, no, good question. Thank you, Justin. And I will lightly touch on it as we get into the Excel discussion. It's not a mistake. I am on the negotiating team on the Excel settlement discussion, and as we are identifying specific projects that were good candidates for something broader than just a short-term project, but allowed us to kind of explore some of the challenging nature of for example, designing a microgrid. We have alpine balsam, we have the East Boulder sub-community plan. And I said, well, Chautauqua might be a good candidate too, because we're looking at kind of mixing up these various guiding principles and priorities around historic preservation, ecosystem preservation, the built environment, undergrounding power lines, trying to design on-site generation where there aren't good locations. So it was identified as a potential site for kind of digging into some of these various issues because it's happening in real time.
Any other questions for Jonathan on Chautauqua resiliency?
I'm just curious. I haven't been up there since COVID started. I haven't really been anywhere, but outside of our neighborhood. But I'm just wondering, has foot traffic and everything decreased, or is it increased, or has it been about the same? I'm just curious if it's been the pressures of parking and people hiking and walking around.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that Shelley Benford, the executive director, in a conversation perhaps a month and a half ago, had remarked that things were pretty busy. But again, I think visitorship and the way the site is being used perhaps is different. I mean, as we all flocked to get outdoors and yeah, I think a lot of people use Chautauqua, and if anybody from Open Space is on, they could probably attest to the fact that the trails, the impact on trails has been pretty severe, and Chautauqua is no exception.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Well, I guess if there's nothing else for Jonathan on Chautauqua, we can move on to the franchise agreement.
Do you want, Justin, just if you'd like to pause and see if Brett has drafted any language for the board to consider? Yeah. I'm happy to pause.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, so let me just put on the screen my best effort at capturing kind of the spirit of what you guys have been talking about both now and in the past. Can you see this quote starting with the Environmental Advisory Board?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I'll just let you all read it rather than reading it to you.
Yeah, I think it's good. How do we, I'll be quiet for a minute.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's pretty good. I guess just trying to make sure the second sentence captures what we talked about. For me, the first sentence looks exactly what we discussed. I don't know that we got into the detail of the second one.
Okay.
Right. I think I was trying to capture something that I thought was emerging, but you guys could cut the second sentence if you don't think it's.
I mean, I think you were getting at, maybe trying to get at my comments around like being happy to see like the ability to assess as we move forward. Yeah. And so I like it, but you don't have to keep it if no one else likes it.
Miriam, can you see the screen even though we can't see you?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Just make sure we didn't need to read it to you.
No, I got it. No, I agree with the statement as well.
How do we make sure we capture Susan's abstainment, Brett, in here? How do we?
It would show in, this would be your motion, and then we will record basically if there's one abstention or something that would be recorded below this.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I could support this. Marty, Miriam.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. Well, that was easy.
Yeah, look at us.
Susan, you still want to maintain your abstention in this?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Good. So we will record this. So Justin, I need to work with Jonathan about this because he's got more experience. But I think what was suggested to me is that you as board chair would send a letter to the mayor saying, EAB is met. We have the following recommendation for you, with 4 board members voting in support and 1 abstaining.
Okay.
We'll draft that up for you, and by tomorrow figure out how that's conveyed with essentially your digital signature.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, let me know. I'm around for the rest of the week.
Okay. Heidi, I'll convey this to you right now.
Can I mention just one little grammar thing? My incredible contribution here tonight, but in the last sentence where it says both recovery of, and then it lists multiple things, it would probably be better to say something like achieve the multiple objectives of,
Okay,
and then the rest of the sentence.
got it. Thank you.
You got the both.
Had to do some editing as a team, or else it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting.
I think I'm always guilty of using both too much, so this is great. Thank you. Okay, great. I also just wanted to note, Brenda, knowing that you have to attend way too many late meetings, and I think we could probably let you go if you wanted to return to your own life.
Great. Yeah, I think you have Zoom experts here on the call with you from our orientation session. So if anything weird should happen, then I'm sure you'll all be able to figure it out together.
I've been on Zoom since 8:30 this morning.
Right. So exactly. So I will leave Mike in charge, but Heidi will now take over the hosting role. And I appreciate that, Brett. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so I do want to give a short introduction to this last segment of our, this part of our agenda. The amount of work that has gone into the effort to explore a settlement with Excel is really colossal, especially given the remarkably short period of time in which this potential completion of, you know, over a decade's work is being trying to be accomplished, and no one has probably worked harder on that than Jonathan. So just want to send another round of appreciation to him as he provides you with this update on kind of where things stand.
Yeah, thanks. And now, as someone who negotiates a lot of settlements with Excel, I understand how much of a colossal effort it is.
Excellent. Thank you, Brett. So I'm going to try to be very disciplined in my remarks. This is a very, very complex issue. We could spend hours trying to dissect the parts and pieces of this. And so what I thought I would do is share with you the presentation that we gave to City Council just recently, and I want to move through it pretty quickly so we can get to questions, and then I can give you an update on where things sit right now, because it's been evolving pretty rapidly. But as Brett said, you know, I have been working on the parts and pieces of our relationship with Excel really since 2007. When we first entertained a franchise agreement that led up to our major move in 2010 that really started the municipalization effort in earnest, and been part of the team working on the parts and pieces over the past decade, and have been involved in all of the negotiation or settlement discussions that have taken place since 2010. And this one does feel different. And I think what is included as potential settlement components is quite a bit different than what has been offered in the past. So I want to go through this again relatively quickly. If I say something that is confusing, please interrupt me. I'm not offended at all if I use an acronym or something in this presentation. But I want to get to the points that are probably most important for all of you to hear about. Okay, so I'm going to once again share my screen. Okay, so just if someone could verify that you see a blue PowerPoint screen that says potential Excel settlement. Okay, thank you. Okay, so what I want to do is kind of start with a little bit of not much background, but as we have talked about municipalization over the past decade, we have remained consistent on the goals. And I stress this because we have always said it is not about the poles and wires. It's really about meeting the goals that our community established back in 2010 through 2013. And those are largely around the 3 Ds, which are decarbonization, decentralization, and democratization. And then embedded within that are what we call the 3 Rs. How do we have an influence on rates or costs? How do we think about reliability? And how do we think about renewables? And obviously you can draw lines between these boxes because they each support and kind of embed within another, but these have been kind of the very high level goals that have guided us. We have a whole series of very specific objectives under each of these, which I won't go into. So you all have probably read much of the press on this issue. We have been moving forward on our municipalization effort in earnest. We've made a lot of progress over the past year, particularly as it relates to the regulatory environment and moving to our condemnation action. Late last year, early 2020, conversations began between Alice Jackson, who is the president of PSCO, which is Public Service of Colorado. They operate, it's Excel operating in Colorado, and two of our council members, Sam Weaver, Mayor, and Mayor Pro Tem Bob Yates. Those conversations were really predicated on, is there perhaps an opportunity to revisit the idea of settlement or settling our municipalization effort and changing course, either suspending or doing away with municipalization. Those conversations took place in the early months of 2020. I believe if any of you chimed in to the presentations that were given by Sam or Bob, they described that relationship in those conversations. All of that led to an assembly of staff teams to begin working on the parts and pieces of an agreement. And I want to say that our objective and our marching orders from Council was to work with Excel and bring forward the very best agreement that we can. It will be Council's decision whether or not they believe it's a good enough settlement to put before voters this fall. It will be Council's decision to decide whether they endorse the settlement. But from the staff perspective, our objective and our marching orders was to go get what you can possibly get in this agreement, bring it forward, and then hand it off to Council and the community for their review and evaluation of whether or not it meets the intent of our energy future. So the parts and pieces of the settlement that have been agreed to at this point, I'll just kind of hit the bullet points. The big one, of course, is the assurance of the 80% carbon reduction by 2030 goal. This is a legislative requirement that Excel must meet. However, we actually got them to agree to interim emission targets, not percentages, but actual emissions reduced. And I'll show that on the next screen. Why this is important is that we wanted to ensure not that they would get there by 2030, but they were on a trajectory to really front load and show that they were reducing emissions early and fast, not just waiting until 2029 when they were legislated to meet those requirements. A secondary agreement is our energy partnership agreement. This was really around the local projects, and it isn't about doing projects for the sake of doing projects, but really how can we design projects that really help us understand what it is we're trying to achieve? How can we create replicable models for other communities? So, for example, let's not just do one microgrid. Let's figure out how you design microgrids. Why do you want to do a microgrid? Is it about building resilience? Is it about transactive energy? Is it about carbon? Is it about emission reduction? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And so the partnership agreement really is around facilitating grid planning and helping Boulder achieve its 100% renewable electricity goal by 2030. And remember, Boulder has a 100% renewable electricity goal. Excel is required to get to an 80% reduction in carbon. So those two things are not exactly the same. Obviously, they interrelate, but they're important to recognize the differences. Third, we wanted to ensure, and Council wanted us to ensure, that we had a landing space, meaning if we choose and the relationship does not work out like we hope to, if we sign an agreement, that we can go back to municipalization. We have put a lot of work and time and money into the municipalization effort. And what we would want to ensure is that we don't go back to the starting line. We actually can pick up in some sense where we are leaving off. And I'll talk about how we are ensuring that as I get into some later slides. We also have the issue of undergrounding. So there is the 1% undergrounding fund that communities have access to when you are a franchisee of the company. And actually, this is a provision that Boulder put into franchises years ago. And so we agreed to a catch-up. We have essentially lost out and not had access to roughly $33 million. Half of that would be available in the first 5 years for aggressive undergrounding projects. And then, why do we have this? Franchise ballot measure and suspension of municipalization efforts. So the essential guts of the thing are all of the agreements are not things that need to be voted on. The one thing that Boulder voters need to vote on is the franchise agreement. And that's what would go to voters either in a general election or subsequent election. Okay, let me just jump to the carbon reduction metrics. I think this is something you all might be interested in. So starting at the top, 2005, Boulder's actual emitted carbon is roughly 34 million tons. So that is the baseline by which Excel needs to measure their 80% reduction targets. Boulder is part of the working groups that are essentially working on the clean energy plans and how this will be measured in the future. And so it's been very interesting to see how important these short or interim targets are. So by 2019, they reduced their emissions to just under 20 million tons. And what we were able to get them to agree to is actual numeric targets in 2022, 24, 27, and the actual number in 2030. Why this is important is that we have negotiated the ability to get out of the franchise if they don't hit these targets. And I'll show you these here in just a moment. So the question is, how do you measure that? Well, there are a number of ways. There are a number of regulatory filings where Excel will have to show what their actual tons emitted are. They are part of the climate registry, which is really from the stack emissions. There are different ways to count those emissions, and we want to make sure that they are actual aggregated emissions being emitted by their generation, and methane from natural gas. So these numbers are real and they need to be verified. So again, as I said, we would have the ability to vote to end the franchise without any reason. This is a negotiated out in 2026, so that's the 5-year out. By right, cities have the ability to get out of the franchise by vote after 10 or 15 years. We added an additional at 5 years. So we also negotiated that we could end the franchise. And when I say by vote, that's by 2/3 or a supermajority of council members or a vote of the people. So Boulder can also end the franchise in 2023, 25, and 2028 if they fail to meet those emission reduction targets from the previous year. So essentially we have outs. We have the ability to get out of franchise in 2023, 25, 26, 28, 30, 31, and 36. So there's a lot of outs. The hope would be that we enter into an agreement that we don't have to exercise those outs, that we would move into a good partnership to be able to execute the projects that we want to execute. Okay, so looking at how we would identify projects and programs, we have essentially put together a process of a pipeline of projects. And I want to stress this because it's very easy to kind of look at a list and say, oh, look, that's interesting. They're going to do a microgrid, or they're going to do a distributed generation project, or they're going to work on transactive energy. I want to stress it's not about those projects. It's about the pipeline of projects, and to evaluate and how we move those things from kind of concept to execution is really being done around a number of partnership groups. So looking at an executive team represented by the president of Excel, Alice Jackson, I mentioned earlier, and then folks from their senior director of state affairs, or vice president of strategic and key accounts. We would then have equal representation, whether it be our city manager and others working on this executive team. We also have an oversight team and an advisory panel, which would incorporate a lot of expertise like yourselves to really think through what are the right projects and what are we doing as partners moving forward. Specific projects that were identified in the projects list as the short-term immediate projects, really looking at microgrids. Justin mentioned the Chautauqua undergrounding of power lines at Chautauqua is one of the short-term projects. We're looking at alpine balsam as a way to demonstrate net zero energy. We're looking at a hydrogen energy storage project, looking at projects that really allow us to dive deeply into energy equity. What is inequitable about our current energy system, and how do we put money and projects towards increasing equity? I think that's a really important one for us to stay very, very focused on. And so we have a broad list of projects that are kind of in the queue, that are surfacing, and we would want to identify the action plans to be able to execute those. So here is the more interesting part of the agreement. A lot of the projects that we want to execute are limited. We have regulatory constraints. They have been there for some time, which is why we chose the option to go municipalize. Realized we can't work outside that regulatory construct. So we asked Excel, it said one of our conditions or must-haves is that you work with Boulder to go to either substantially increase or eliminate the 120% rule on on-site generation. This is an antiquated rule. It's been in place for a very long time. Why this matters, I'll just illustrate it. So those of us that want to put solar on our rooftops are limited to the previous year's aggregated load, and it cannot exceed 120%. Meaning you have a big roof space, but you don't use a lot of electricity, you're limited on how big your solar panels can be. Now, that may just seem like a nuisance and not a big deal. Where it becomes an issue is you start thinking about resilience. If you think about a location like a church, very low load. If you want to identify a church as a sheltering site, for example, and they want to actually put solar and cover all of their roof space, they can't because they were limited by the 120% rule. If you want to think about large warehouses that have very little load, if you want to think about projects in greenfield sites where there is no load, removing this restriction is a very, very big deal. I mentioned Chautauqua and putting solar on that water tank. There is no load on that water tank. Therefore, you can't go through the traditional means of designing and developing a solar project because of this limitation. This is a state law. This is not an Excel rule. We would need to go and get a sponsor. But if Excel doesn't support this, it'll never happen. They've agreed to go and make it happen.
Are you guys also looking to allow virtual net metering or something like that in conjunction
Yes.
with it?
Yes. And that goes, let me see, actually it's not on this list. The other issue is transactive energy and how, particularly as you think about microgridding, you can't really microgrid. You can't move power or wheel power across property boundaries. So what you can do is what we commonly refer to as a nanogrid. You can do it on one site, like we've done at Via Mobility, for example. But if we can remove those barriers and do more transactive energy and do things like wheeling and virtual net metering, those are huge keys to unlock great potential for really innovative projects. So we really keyed in and zeroed in on where are the restrictions, and we work with Excel to remove them. Otherwise, we just find ourselves working within the current constraints, working within their current boundaries and with their current programs. So these are really important kind of partnership elements. So you can see things like facilitating microgrids. The other big piece that we were able to negotiate is the sharing of data. We have had a dickens of a time over the past 10 to 15 years getting good information about load profile, specific information about the effectiveness of programs, subscription rates, how we might be able to identify stressed locations on our distribution system, locations that might be very good for microgridding or very good for storage technologies, or where should we put level 1 charging, for example, or DC fast charging for vehicles. So these are the types of things that we have wanted to know, particularly if we're going to move aggressively on electrifying our buildings and electrifying our mobility. We need that level of data. So we were able to come to an agreement on getting a huge amount of information about how the system is currently functioning and the effectiveness of our programs. Okay, so shifting really quickly, I mentioned this idea about maintaining our position on municipalization. So we're able to agree to a cap of $200 million that covers a number of important unknowns. When we condemn and acquire the system, we have appraised the system, Excel appraises the system. We go to a condemnation judge who reviews those two appraisals and then settles on a number. In that, you may have heard phrases or terms like going concern, which is future lost profits. We have a strong belief that they are not subject to going concern. Excel believes that they do. It will be up to a judge to determine whether they award going concern or damages to the remainder. We were able to get a cap This, again, this doesn't mean that this is a number we would pay, but a cap, a ceiling of acquisition cost, real property interest, going concern, damage to the remainder, and the purchase of 2 existing substations, all to be under that cap. We would still litigate it. We would still go to condemnation court, but it would be a do not exceed number. This assurance and the certainty around that acquisition cost is really important, because this is the money that we have to pay up front. You've heard about things like stranded cost. That's a cost that can be negotiated and paid through rates over time. It's less of a concern. So when we have to go out and bond to actually acquire the system, this is the number that matters. So this gives us some assurance on what the cap might be. We're also able to come to agreement on several substation issues. We also, I'm just kind of going through things that are important to you, lots of kind of nuts and bolts about interconnection studies and design drawings about how we would be able to immediately pick up on some of the distribution system separation issues. And let me just kind of move on that stuff. If you have questions on that, I can go back. So again, the idea is that if we come to an agreement, we would suspend our municipalization effort. The voters would need to approve the franchise. There are a number of things that would happen then. We have a cost agreement that would be held in abeyance. We would essentially dismiss our current FERC proceeding. There are things around letters of credit that would be released, and those are lines of credit for the separation of the system. So these are things that we have agreed to collectively. The current case in the Court of Appeals would continue. That's ongoing right now. We would dismiss our condemnation case. Again, that is our case to go and acquire the system. That's the piece that we would have to pick up should we choose an off-ramp. We'd have to refile that condemnation petition with the court. And so we would discontinue all of our court actions, and we can pick those back up in the future should we choose to do so. A second piece of this that was brought up by counsel is currently the funds that are collected through the utility occupation tax on customers' bills, a portion of it right there, 4.7 million, goes to the general fund, pays for general fund activities, police, fire, libraries, etc. The 2.1 million is a portion that is intended to expire, where they both expire December 31st, 2020. Council asked if we could, if we enter into a franchise, repurpose that 2.1 million for the actual projects that have been identified in the settlement. So that is a second ordinance that council might be taking up. They actually asked us to draft it. We did. We talked about it Tuesday night, last night, with council. And so there would be a couple of things that would go to voters should council move it forward. One would be the franchise agreement. The second would be an ordinance repurposing the utility occupation tax dollars. It wouldn't be a new tax. It would be a continuation of the existing tax. I'm almost done, I promise. Why this was up there, council was interested in knowing if we extended that UOT, what would we use it for? And so these are the types of projects that we believe would be high on the projects list. How do we really accelerate electrification of buildings and transportation? Projects to enhance our community-based resilience, research and technology pilot projects. We spent a fair amount of time talking with the great research facilities that we have here locally to be able to kind of add a new dimension to pilot projects. And then thinking about that equity and accessibility and energy programs. Okay, this is my last slide, but I want to make sure you understand this. We had the first reading of the franchise last night. Council did the first reading of the franchise and also the UOT, the Utility Occupation Tax Ordinance. They did move it off of first reading. The second reading is scheduled to occur August 20th. You might note, if your calendar serves, that is not a Tuesday. That is actually a special meeting that will be held on a Thursday. The reason being, this is a big topic. There will be a lot of people wanting to speak to this issue. One of the issues that staff has raised and was raised last night with council by one of our council members is the pace. The intention is to get all of the agreements that have been crafted out for public consumption tomorrow. Friday is a furlough day, mandatory furlough day for the city, and we committed to getting them out by the end of the week, which means by the end of the day tomorrow. You might realize that doesn't give a whole lot of time for the community to read them, understand them, and provide input, because what the schedule provides is a last deadline date of September 1st to place measures on the ballot. So that means if we go to a second reading on August 20th, then any changes would need to be made prior to September 1st. That's a very tough timeline. It's a very tough timeline for a community to actually provide meaningful input. So one of the proposals was there is no requirement that a franchise needs to go on a general election ballot in November. The city has the potential to do special elections. We could choose to do so at any given time in the spring, for example. So there is a cost to doing that. The cost is typically around $30,000 to $40,000. When it's a franchise, Excel is required to pay. Whether they would agree to that, we don't know. We don't know if Excel is even willing to entertain a delay in the process to allow our community to understand and digest and provide input. So that is one of the options that's being discussed. The drawback is it's definitely a different electorate in a presidential general election than it would be in a special election. So that's an issue. But this is something that Council discussed very briefly last night. We don't know if they will choose to go to a special election or even move this to an election altogether. So if they do, if they stick with the schedule, then the franchise and the UOT we placed on the ballot be voted on November 3rd, and then the franchise would become effective January 2021. So that was a lot. I know there are lots of nooks and crannies of that you may have questions about. I'm sorry if that took a long time, but this is a pretty complex issue, and I apologize. I'm happy to field any questions that you have.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Matt. Good.
I guess it's 8 o'clock, so I want to be cognizant of folks' time, but also we haven't met in a few months, so I think it's okay if we go a little long. I think if we could, it would be great to send, if there's an agreement to be had among EAB to provide a recommendation to council on this. I think it would be great if we could reach that. So maybe, I don't know if it's worth having a brief conversation about that before we get into any questions from Jonathan, just realizing that I'm sure folks have a lot of questions on the agreement itself, but I guess, my personal feeling is, seems like a good deal, and we've spent a lot of time on this, and, I think it's time to put this to the voters, and that council should move to put it to an election. Whether they choose to support it or not, I don't think we need to get into, but I think it's time to put it to the voters. Whether it's a special election or the general election, my preference would be the general election, but I don't know that we need to get into that level of detail.
I
Justin,
should say, oh, sorry, please.
Sorry, this is Miriam. I was just going to say, I agree with trying to put some sort of recommendation in front of council from the EAB, but I think we should discuss what that recommendation should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
That was the goal. I guess
Okay.
I kind of give my opinion.
You're just putting
which
it out
is
there. Yeah.
Just to put the, I think something broad about just trying to get this franchise agreement before voters.
Maybe just as a process suggestion, we might want to start with, does anyone have questions for Jonathan regarding his presentation? And then maybe the board could go around and make statements about where they stand on the suggestion that Justin's made.
I think I have maybe what's a dumb question that maybe I just don't understand it or missed it. So what's the difference in cost to the community of going this route versus going the municipalization route? Do we save money and achieve the same goal? Or is it cost about the same? I guess that's my first question.
Yeah, it's not a dumb question at all, and it's a bit of an apples and oranges to some extent, because there is absolutely a cost to municipalize. There is a cost to get it across the finish line, which means you have debt that you are taking on, right? You have your acquisition cost, which is roughly about 25 to 30% of your annual debt service. some will argue all of the analyses we have done, just a lion's share of analysis over a decade, more than any other community has done on this topic. I will say that with strong conviction. One of the arguments for municipalization is that you save a lot of money over time because you are essentially tapping the wholesale market, and you were able to buy power from whomever you want. Case in point, we actually did release a request for indicative pricing in 2018. We got responses back from wholesale providers saying that we could be 91% renewable on day one and see about a $40 million cost savings annually compared to what we pay Xcel retail. We just released a second RFP. Responses are due on August 14th. So we will be updating those numbers because it's important to be able to contrast to say, here is a settlement agreement. What do we know about continuing with municipalization? We don't know all of the costs, but it is known that there are cost savings, but you have to get it across the finish line. We still have to pay to get there. And then there's still a risk of potential stranded cost being levied, and we don't know what that is. We have a good idea. So, I guess your question is, in terms of associated cost, there's no cost necessarily, monetary cost, to go into an agreement with Xcel. We're not paying them to do so. We actually get the renewed franchise fee back, but it's the potential lost savings that you might put into the calculus and the potential additional revenue by actually owning and operating the utility. Again, that's the contrast that needs to be made, and people have strong feelings on both sides of that.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful though.
Jonathan, this is Marty. You've probably talked about this, but bringing this forward to the public at this time, the public may be less inclined to do anything that's a change given the COVID situation. We're fearful of things as they are. Changing something so radical may no longer be the appetite of the public. How do you feel about that?
It's an interesting time. I mean, I think there's a resonance in being bold right now. But on this particular issue, I would say it was not, my personal feeling is we didn't design this timeline. I think we talked earlier this year as a staff team with Counsel, in fact, very publicly about our budget situation, and that we were not inclined to do anything disruptive this year. It's not the right time to do that. Xcel brought this to the table. They were the ones that essentially said, we want to work on a settlement agreement, and it's Counsel who has said that they would like to get an agreement to the point that they could consider putting this before voters. I think it's a very challenging year for a number of reasons. And I don't know that we will get the kind of response, whether it be the turnout or to your point, I think some may have weak knees on continuing down an unknown path of municipalization, and maybe they're not completely happy. I'm speaking, just speculating. They may not be completely happy with Xcel as a company. They are making progress. We've actually contributed to them making progress, and maybe that's the better approach. Some have said, no, now is a perfect example of why a local utility is something we want, because a utility could be providing revenue back to our general fund and to our coffers and providing a level of support in long-term recovery. So again, I'm giving you a non-answer. I think it's a very good question. And I don't want to hide behind the political leadership and to say this is Council's decision, but it truly is at this point.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is, just to follow up real quick, they sometimes call it the supply chain, if you will. And if the chain by which we receive our electricity, basically, what we need to turn on our lights, if that chain is locally controlled, that's powerful in a world in which you want more local control. If we learn nothing from COVID, the supply chain needs to be shortened if we want to be resilient. Mm-hmm. And long supply chains are undesirable. I don't know if that was a point that was raised before COVID. It certainly, to me, seems like an obvious point today. If you can shorten that supply chain, you're self-reliant and you can pull yourself up on your bootstraps through your own means.
Yes, Marty, thank you. Just a very brief response to that. It's why local generation is one of our key objectives. Again, Boulder has a 100% renewable electricity target, but we have a local generation target of 100 megawatts by 2030 as well, for that very reason. Currently, we sit at about 60 megawatts of installed capacity. So it is one of the fundamental pillars by which we negotiated. We said, look, sure, you guys might be carbon-free electricity, but that does not support our resilience goals. That does not support the ability for our low income or fixed income to take advantage of low cost or free power from the sun. So these are our objectives, and they connect to our local values. And it is important that we don't give up on those. That's our North Star. And if we can do that through a relationship with Excel, great. We know we can do it if we create a locally owned and operated utility, because it is essentially what it will be built upon.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I had a question for Jonathan. I guess I'll say a concern first, since you just said that's our North Star. My main concern is that our North Star is not the same as Excel's North Star. But I'm just wondering, to me, this is way too fast. It's August, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and we're gonna draft something by September 1st to get it onto a general election. So I'm wondering, besides the general election, and besides Excel coming to us, what's driving us to do this so quickly? What are the other driving factors?
No, Susan, thank you for the question. You hit them. That's it. I mean, honestly, and I understand your position, and it's a position that I understand very, very directly, because we have built a relationship with our community throughout this 10-year process that is inclusive and transparent. And I'll just speak for myself. I won't speak for Counsel or the rest of the staff team. It's painful. It's painful to realize that we don't even have agreements and language out there for our community to look at, much less provide input. And we're asking them to provide a level of input that's, pretty important. This is a big decision in a matter of a week. And then to try to turn around any of those comments and try to figure out how that shapes the agreements before September 1st is a big challenge. Tom Carr said it last night, our city attorney said, these are agreements that take months to negotiate and draft. We're drafting them in a matter of days.
Yeah, and it's only because Excel is driving it. And you've been to many more PUC meetings than I have, Jonathan, I'm sure, but in the few that I went to, I was actually kind of appalled by all of the delay tactics and kind of underhanded stuff going on with Excel. So I don't have a very good feeling about them trying to railroad this through.
Jonathan, I just do want to ask you the question, or maybe give you the chance to respond to this. Do you think Excel is the only factor driving this process?
No, thanks, Brendan. And I was going to respond to that that comment, Susan. I think that the timeline is really the general election. The reality is, in order to execute an agreement, it travels with the franchise agreement that has to be approved by voters. So the timeline is not necessarily driven by Excel. It's driven by our desire, the collective desire, whether that be Council or Excel. I think they would love to see this go to a vote this fall too. But many would like to see this resolved this fall, which means the timeline is predicated and driven by getting the things completed by September 1st.
I guess there's the risk of, I think you touched on this too, of trying to do this after working on one avenue so long and then switching to something different in a very quick timeline. And I feel like you run a very high risk of like public perception of trying to sneak something through, or you know what I mean? Like a little bit of a negative public perception associated with it. Maybe not, I don't know. It seems like it could go that way. You know?
I guess, given that this is a negotiation, so if you had infinite time, what would your process look like? You would take what you've negotiated to, as part of public participation, to the community, and then you would take input on that, and then you would take that back to Excel and try to renegotiate the agreement you've already agreed to. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, no, thank you, Justin. I don't have the design of what it would look like. I guess if I was making it up right now on the spot, I would say there would be a couple objectives. Number one, give our community the ability to digest and understand what is being agreed to, provide some input into the various documents and how they're working and reconciling one to another. And I think the goal would be to say, we're not going to move the goalposts, Excel. We have the framework for the agreement. The franchise and the agreement that we are in the package of agreements that we're discussing are agreements between the Boulder community and Excel, not city staff and Excel. So the concept would be give the community an opportunity to understand what's there, ask questions, refine language, for example. And we'd have to give some guardrails to say, no, we're not just going to add a bunch of new stuff to it, but working within the framework that we have negotiated, how can we ensure that the language is correct, that it's enforceable, that it's defensible, and it's verifiable. So I think the process could be something that was broader than our community listening sessions that we held, but more an opportunity to really listen and hear from our community about what they like and what they don't like about how it's currently drafted.
I guess at the end of the day, I mean, you still achieve a lot of goals either way. So it's not like you're faced with a short timeline or like a terrible alternative. And I mean, there's probably pluses and minuses to both sides, but you also it seems like we have the capacity to achieve a lot of goals through either route, you know?
Well, I mean, I guess, one of them is before you and one is a long-term goal.
Yeah.
I see it, you've got the opportunity to work with the incumbent utility to make tangible process today, whereas, municipalization is still an unknown timeline. It'll happen eventually if the city puts enough time and resources to it. I have no doubt about that. But when that would happen, given how successfully Excel has been at litigating this, and I don't see them I don't see them slowing down their fight. And Jonathan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if the goal is municipalization, that's, is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Who knows?
Well, that's a really good point, because this starts you on the road to achieving a lot of goals with respect to emissions. And then it gives you off ramps in several places to go the other way if this isn't working, I guess. So it makes me feel.
That's how I see it. And feels like, it's been good work over 10 years, but, I think it's time to give the voters something tangible to react to. And I guess it seems like, it needs to get on the ballot by September 1st, but voters then have a few months to look through it and decide if it's something that they can support in its current form or not. And I agree that ideally maybe you'd have more time for input, but.
I mean, yeah, this is not the worst outcome of like working on something and then finally getting Excel to make a bunch of
meets you halfway
to work with us. I mean, you could almost frame it as ideal in a way.
I wouldn't frame it as ideal.
Not ideal, but all right.
Excel's North Star is their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. A municipally owned utility would have a fiduciary responsibility to our community and our citizens. And there's so many changes happening in technology right now, particularly technology that facilitates local solar production and local microgrids and a more locally resilient system where we have our own storage. And none of those things maximize Excel's profits. Those are community benefits for us, but it's really hard for me to imagine how Excel's going to say, oh yeah, it's just like awesome. We would love for you to all make your own electricity and share it and power your own electric car with it. It's just, it doesn't contribute to their bottom line. And let's face it, they're a corporation. That's their bottom line is, and their profitability is their main thing. So we might have different goals We've talked about equity. We've talked about social justice. We've talked about, in addition to climate initiatives. And those are things that I do not believe are in alignment with Excel's responsibility to return maximum value to their shareholders. And I wanted to point out, you know, there were 4 town halls. I printed out today the comments from those town halls, and I actually listened to one of them. And I know they're not quantitative, and this is really not scientific, but I just went through and I kind of marked with the green highlighter people who were not so in favor of this idea, and with the orange highlighter, people who thought the franchise agreement was a good thing. And I'm not seeing very much.
You can't really see the details. It doesn't.
Okay, well, I'm just, the details. The detail is every page is mostly people who are still in favor of a municipal utility. And the orange is people who think the franchise agreement is a good idea. So it's, again, not quantitative or not scientific, but there have been 4 town halls and the feedback was pretty skewed.
Well, I guess it doesn't seem like we're gonna be able to reach any consensus as a board, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. So maybe it's worth adjourning for the night unless there are other questions for Jonathan.
Well, consensus on what question?
I guess I think the question before us is whether we could support that council should put this to the voters put it to the voters either at a general election or a special election. I guess that's whether we could get to that level of detail. That's that's a second question.
I mean, is there one question before us about the merits of a municipalization versus a franchise?
It's not the merit. It's not the merits of the. I mean, I don't think we need to weigh in on the merits of the argument.
Well, from the point of view of the environment.
Well, I think the thing to frame for you all is you are in service to the council, and council has a decision to make, and that decision is about whether or not to refer this settlement to a community vote. And the question is whether the EAB wants to make a statement to council about how council should make that choice.
Exactly. I think that the question before us is whether this franchise agreement should go to voters and let them yay or nay to go forward or not.
Sure.
So I think, I mean, this is my thought coming back to some of the important points Jonathan was making. It's complicated. We're challenged to understand it. I mean, we just got a nice summary and not complete at that. Obviously, it would take many, many hours. Is it something where the voters are, I don't want to use the word competent, but are capable of actually making a decision? Are we asking too much of the voters in making this decision?
Well, so we have a choice, right? I mean, if this is, the franchise agreement has to be approved by voters, correct, Jonathan?
Yes, that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think whether or not we think voters are capable of understanding the nuance doesn't really matter. You know, if the city wants to pursue this and a number of council members have said that they do, it has to go to voters. And municipalization has been before voters a number of times over the last 10 years. So, I think the community is smart enough to understand.
So, well, I don't know if I agree with you on that, but let me just say this. Does the recommendation that it should go to the voters from the EAB, I don't want it to be confused with an endorsement of a franchise versus a municipalization. That's very carefully distinguished. And so the language needs to be really worked through carefully on that.
Understood.
Okay.
Marty, thank you, Justin. If you'll indulge me just one moment, I appreciate that distinction very much, because I would caution the board from treating this as a referendum on municipalization or settlement. That's not the question before you. You have no obligation as a board to endorse any pathway. one of the things that council is wrestling with right now is the scheduled go, no-go vote. We had intended to bring forward the ballot concept of moving forward with the municipalization. That's not what this is. This is whether we stop the municipalization process and take this alternative pathway. And so the question before the board is, and I think Brett said this probably correctly, and I don't just need to repeat it, but whether or not you think your voice should be heard in encouraging council to either put this to the vote this year or not put this to the vote. You can decide if you want to explore the merits of the agreement or not. There are a number of letters that have come from entities like the State Energy Office and others that kind of explore what's good about it, what's bad about it. You can decide whether or not you want to do that as a board, but there's no obligation for you.
So to Jonathan, sorry, just as staff, to make sure we help you be really clear, there are two different types of recommendations. One, should this settlement be put to the voters? And second, do you have some comment on the merits of what should be put to voters? And council actually has to decide both of those things too. It can choose to put something in front of voters and not make a statement about its value, or it could make a negative statement about its value. But so those are the two questions. Do you want to recommend to council that they should put it in front of voters? And then do you want to make a statement about the merits of it?
Yeah, and I guess I was assuming we do not have time at this meeting to talk about the merits of municipalization. That's a whole different
or settlement in this case.
Yeah, or the merits of the settlement. It was more, could we reach an agreement that says that we, suggest, request, recommend that council vote to move and put the franchise agreement to voters.
And just so that, I love this. I love this. I love that actually there are moments where we don't necessarily know that we're in agreement. So that's great, fantastic. That's the sign of a healthy board. You could choose to sort of take a census or a vote to say, like, where do we stand on this, and then decide whether you want to send that forward. Like if the majority of you said yes, we wanted to refer this to the voters, but you were 3-2 or something, you could decide, like, we're not very well aligned here, so we don't want to move that recommendation forward to the board. So just know that you have options here. Just because, yeah.
Yeah, my feeling is, I think if we can speak with unanimity, that's powerful. If we're not unanimous, I guess, say maybe we should just be silent at this time. Others can disagree with me, but that's sort of my feeling about how we've worked in the past. I think when we'll try to get to unanimous when we're talking to council. So I'd rather not put a split decision forward.
I agree with that, Justin.
And I think Justin has also suggested that this is not a discussion about the merits of the settlement. The question that you're considering is, do you all want to propose to council that they do make the settlement, put the settlement on the ballot in November or not?
So I would want to have a little more discussion amongst our board on the pros and cons of it going to the public for vote. In other words, what are the concerns that would cause us to not endorse such a move? And what are why do we feel, on the other hand, why do we feel that there are limited concerns and there's only upside, no downside, if you will, to making that move?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, given the time, I don't know if folks want to stay on, we can have that more detailed discussion, but I feel like that's a pretty long conversation potentially. So I don't know how to move forward given that it's 8:30.
Well, one thing you could do is you could do a quick straw, sort of like up, down, like how many people think that they're sort of leaning towards, yes, you should put it to settlement, or no, yes, you should put it on the ballot, or no. So you could do some sensing before you make a final call on that, or
yeah. All right, should we do a straw vote? I think I've made it clear I think it's time to put this to voters. I think it's a good, I also think it's a good deal.
I agree with you, Justin. I also need to leave in a minute to put my kid to bed and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it should be on the ballot.
And I think it's too fast for this general election. And once we had a better understanding of both the costs and the benefits on both sides, and we had a well-constructed like franchise agreement that could be easily communicated, then I might recommend that we put it on the ballot. But I think it's too fast and too soon.
Understandable. Marty?
My concern is that there's not enough information for the public to make an informed decision given the time allowed. It's asking an awful lot. Now, I have confidence in the democratic process and that the people have the responsibility to self-educate and for difficult decisions to do their homework. So by voting against it, I will be voting against our ability to do democratic decision-making. So I'm going to vote for it. I think we should move it forward only because I trust in the American democratic system and the people that are part of that system. So I'm using my political philosophy here. But on a practical matter, I'm concerned. I think it comes a little bit fast. I agree. I really do agree with Susan's concern. But I'm going to say that, you know, we Americans need to pull up our big pants and start doing democracy the right way. So let's put it forward.
Miriam?
I similarly have a concern about the lack of potential information that would be available to the voters on this. But I do agree with it being moved forward for a vote.
So, I mean, it seems like there's a path to something unanimous if we say we support bringing a franchise agreement to voters, you know, give with sufficient time.
Yeah, we could say that bringing it forward, but we are concerned about the timelines and availability of information and to make decisions or
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm concerned about drawing out a process too long also. So I guess I don't, it seems like maybe there's a path forward. I don't know. I guess I'm not optimistic that we can figure it out.
Has council asked us for an opinion?
They haven't. So I think this is on, you know, this is something.
But Susan, just to be clear, this is the role of the board. Things are brought to you and you have the choice to make a call that you want to give council your opinion because you are a citizen advisory board or not.
But yeah, we certainly don't have a statutory requirement to weigh in here. Council hasn't asked us specifically. So, you know, I think we can choose to be silent, which is saying something.
Now, let's just assume that we did unanimously say to move it forward. And I'm not making any judgment here on what we all believe, but let's just say we did. Can we also say that within the reservations that we have discussed, we also advise certain additional material that between now and election day go into the people's hands to be able to better educate themselves on what the consequences of their vote would mean beyond what currently is available? Does that have any merit here?
I mean, I think there's merit to that. It's just the timing issue. I mean, our next meeting isn't until after this decision needs to be made. So we need to deal with it now, which I don't think we have enough time to address that issue. Jonathan?
No, but can we make the recommendation to move it to vote, but with concern and with a recommendation to provide additional substantive information to the public?
Yeah, thank you, Mary.
Jonathan?
Thank you. Appreciate it. I don't want to belabor this anymore, but just a point of clarification, Marty, to your request. I just want you to, I don't want to be clear that the concerns that have been raised about the timing are not making sure that the community understand what are what's actually in the document. That's something that staff does anyway. We put together guides to help really dissect and explain what's there. The concerns that have been raised is really around the drafting. A number of community members have pointed out kind of flawed language and the recognition that you got to get certain things right. Maybe they aren't the right numbers, making sure that the agreements kind of work with one another, maybe adding in certain clauses to the language. So the concern that's been raised is not that we won't understand it or have an informed electorate. It would be, do we have the time to really sharpen the language in these agreements that we are committing to? So those are two different things, and I hope you see the distinction there.
Thank you.
So I think there's a point of choice here. And this is, I would say, the EAB went for almost probably more than a year in which we had actually the opportunity to experience dissent and the question of how to proceed within dissent. So this is fantastic. But it's also an important moment in a new board's sort of life of not wanting to alienate people and starting to create sort of a political process where we don't feel like we can reach consensus. So we have to always be kind of competing in this way. So I guess what I'm wondering about is there a, maybe it's not even a recommendation. You could actually just simply make a statement that the board in general supports something, but we have deep concerns about the pace of the process. And therefore, we would like to see council create a process that creates more space and time for informing the community so that it can make an informed decision.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with that statement personally. I don't think we want unlimited time on this process. I think it's gone on for 10 years. It's time to make a decision. So yeah, I don't know what the path forward is. And would folks want to try to come up with something? Do you think there's value in us trying to? Feels like if there's agreement to be reached in the time that we have, it's going to be really general. Do folks think it's worth putting something really general, saying, hey, we support the idea of putting a franchise agreement to voters, and will probably sort of be a period there eventually, or do folks think it's maybe we try to continue our own education on this process in future meetings, but sort of choose not to make a statement now.
Jonathan, I'm going to ask you a question here. I think that the board's challenge and difficulty here is sort of emblematic of the situation. And that it might be worthwhile for council just to know that the board is kind of having that challenge. But I'm wondering what you think in terms of you've been very close to this process, both with the staff process and the council process. What do you think would be the most useful role for EAB in this context?
Thanks, Brett. It's a tough question. I think council has, they are going to be wrestling with a lot of input on this. Not only are they going to have a public hearing where they will hear all sides of this issue. They've been getting lobbied very, very hard from all sides of this issue constantly since this process began. I guess I would, just to be very honest, what I am trying to think about is what value some statement by the board brings to the conversation, what value it provides to council in making a decision. This is a very unique situation. I have heard, and I believe that council has, as a body and individuals, made statements that they do want to move something to a vote at some point. What they do not agree on is when that might occur. So I think this happened last night when they took a little bit of a poll around moving this forward to from first reading to second reading. In those statements, I believe that each individual council member believes that this should move forward in some fashion to a vote of the people. I think there is perhaps not alignment on when, as I said, I'm just repeating myself at this point. So I guess what I don't want to have you do is agonize over getting the perfect statement and have it just be there in the noise and not really be something that council can look to as something being useful. So I guess my advice would be, if you can get to something that's very specific, that you believe council needs to hear from you as a board, by all means. I think it makes sense. I think that is in fact your role as a board. If you are going to move forward with some general statement, I don't know that it provides much value.
Jonathan, this is Marty. Thank you. That's helpful. What is in my mind and what is my main concern as a member of the EAB is whether the different pathways, let's say the municipalization pathway versus a franchise pathway, which one gets us to a reduction in our emissions fastest, and which one ensures that reduction in emissions is sustainable for the longest period of time. We don't want to have to be concerned that we've got to double back, that we may lose some of the gains, and we don't want to wait a decade to begin making those gains. I know there's so many other considerations that you folks are thinking about, the financial aspects, the risk profile, the reliability, all those things which are perhaps much more important for what the council has to think about. I think our board, I think, can only talk about the environmental aspects of this consideration, which is the maximum speed of reducing the emissions and the maximum assurance of keeping them down. And which of those two pathways do you think would be achieving that outcome? I'm asking your opinion.
Well, let me respond with a non-direct response, but it does provide, I think, the board a pathway, and maybe what provides the value to the council is a reminder that from the board, our strongest concern with whatever pathway is chosen is that it maximizes our ability to decarbonize the electricity sector and provide additional environmental benefits. I mean, you could craft something that's much more eloquent than those words, but as a reminder that this is why this whole process of municipalization was kicked off to begin with. It was about emissions reductions, it was about adding renewables, it was about rates and reliability and all of those things, but really it was about the environmental issue and attributes first and foremost. You could just remind them about how important that is. I can't answer your question directly. I really can't. I think it's very difficult. I've remained very agnostic in this process. Yes, I have been working on the municipalization effort for 13 years, but it is an emotional issue, but I have always remained steadfast that it's about achieving those goals. And if we can get it through other means, great. It's why we've been active at the state legislature. It's why we've been active at the PUC, looking at all pathways. So I guess I will reiterate that if it's just kind of a general statement, I just don't feel like it's going to be valuable, and you're wasting your breath in some sense. But if you can really target in on one particular issue, whether it's, hey, you have an environmental advisory board to remind you how important this particular dimension of your decision is. It doesn't go as far as I think it probably should in making a specific recommendation on this issue. But it's a pathway. It's something that you perhaps could all agree on.
Coming back to Justin here for a moment. Justin, do you see us making a consensus opinion on where the EAB stands in terms of the urgency of taking a course of action, whichever that may be? We'll be agnostic too, perhaps, unless we feel otherwise, but the urgency of getting the emissions reduction in place.
I mean, I think it's a reasonable statement, though part of me feels like that's sort of weighing in on the merits of the franchise agreement, given that there is a gap between the emissions reduction required in the franchise agreement and the city of Boulder's goals. So I guess that's my concern, is that a statement like that could be construed as supporting one side?
Well, let's work on that. That's actually an important point, Justin. Does this board feel like that gap is unacceptable from the EAB's point of view? That we feel that the pathway is there to be 100%, and there's no reason for us to take a partial solution.
Yeah, I guess as Jonathan said, I think this agreement has pathways to get there because renewable energy and carbon are different, and one's looking system-wide at Excel and one's looking at what power is procured to serve the city of Boulder. So Jonathan could probably speak much more eloquently on it to me than I can, but I don't see that disconnect as being a sort of reason definitely not to go forward.
I just feel compelled to say, I think that one of the realizations that staff has been struggling with is that if we really want to accomplish a climate stabilization goal, whether or not Boulder achieves an emissions reduction target may or may not be at all relevant to that if the pathway doesn't become replicable by a lot of other places. So just being able to make sure that Boulder achieves 100% renewable energy, but then nobody else can get there. And so I think influencing Excel across a much broader area has become an even more important part of our objectives in that way.
Or you can, Brett, maybe like the ability to partner with Excel to change that 120% rule could be really powerful. Is that what you're getting at?
It's a consideration, yes, is what I'm saying.
I can see that.
But I think Jonathan's made a very clear statement. It's like, this is a very complicated issue, and unless the board can make a clear and definitive statement about where it stands or remind the council about a specific aspect of the choices that they're making that you want to emphasize.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my sort of feeling is this is a really complicated issue and it doesn't seem like we're going to get there tonight. So maybe we should just adjourn this meeting, and, you know, if we want to, we can pick it up in September if and when we know how council has acted. You know, there may still be more time if they move more towards a special election model or something like that.
I second that.
I third it. Thirded it.
Well, great discussion, folks.
Yeah.
It's nice to see everyone again.
Justin, one last thing. I'm sorry. I made a mistake in that I did not include in your packet the Greenways memo that is now in your hands. Mike, are you still willing to be the rep on the Greenways committee? So if you have a chance and are willing and can look at that Greenways SIP, it's only, I think, 8 pages long, and are willing to give Mike any feedback around that. Mike, any feedback that we have, that group needs by, I think, the 19th of August.
Yeah, I was like, okay, yeah, I can still do that.
Okay, thank you very much. I am sorry for my mistake in that regard.
No worries. Great.
By the way, just real quick to share a personal experience. You know, on my house here, I've got a solar system I installed in 2007, and my neighbor down the street, who's an engineer, he's actually an architect and an engineer. He said, "Well, why are you doing that?" He said, "Why don't you just wait for a better system?" And I said, "Well, the time between what I can do now and when you may have that better system, I may be able to take many tons of carbon out of the air. And when that time comes, when the better system is there, I can always consider installing it." And so he took about 12 years to install what ends up being almost the same system as the one I put on. And so that kind of sits in the back of my mind in this discussion we're having, which is a great discussion. I'm really enjoying it, by the way. I'm learning a lot. I'm learning a lot about each of you, about, you know, this municipalization versus the franchise. It's similar in that sense. And there's also something to be said about the bird in the hand.
Yeah. So
Yep.
I want to say, Mike, I got kids to put to bed too, and I'm so sorry. I've been feeling your pain this whole time.
I know, me too.
All right, let you guys go.
I also have been as well, so.
Welcome, Susan. Thank you for
Thank
being.
you for the welcome. I'm so sorry to be the dissenting.
No,
No,
I
you're
don't-
not.
My
Yeah,
In
very
this case, you're not the dissenting voice. I think there's a lot of agreement with you,
all over the
so.
place.
Yeah. Welcome to that being really clear and direct. So thank you.
Yep.
So Justin, great job on your first iteration as board chair.
Yeah, woohoo.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, I guess is the plan to have continue with virtual meetings monthly now, Brett?
Yeah, probably for a little while.
Okay, well, then I guess we'll see folks in September.
You gotta
Sweet.
Okay, guys.
Take
Call
care,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jonathan.
Great.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Heidi?